Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our virtual town hall. It's called The Divide Between Communities and the Police. I'll be speaking with police chiefs from across the great state of North Carolina. It's hosted by the North Carolina Police Executives Association, and this afternoon, I'm your moderator and host. I'm Akilah Davis. I'm a reporter for ABC 11. I'm really excited, honestly, about the conversation that we're about to have this afternoon. I do want to make mention that it's important to note that George Floyd's death is the catalyst for this conversation that we're about to have. Now, before we get started, just on background, the North Carolina Police Executives Association is the oldest and largest police organization in the state. The organization is taking the lead on not only having these tough conversations, but truly putting them in motion. So as I stated, we'll hear from 4 police chiefs living in different regions of North Carolina. Those cities are Charlotte, Winston-Salem, Apex, and Brevard. So without further ado, let's get started. Chiefs, when I introduce you, if you could please be so kind to just give me a wave. We'll start with Chief Phil Harris. He's Chief of Police in Brevard. That's located in the western part of the state. He has over 30 years of experience in law enforcement, and he serves on numerous boards, including the North Carolina Police Executives Association and the North Carolina Child Fatality Task Force. Chief, can I get you to give me a wave? Hi there.
How are
Chief
you?
John, well, Chief John Letteney is the Chief of Police in Apex. That's near the Research Triangle. He's been recently appointed to the governor's task force for racial equity and racial justice. He's also the 3rd vice president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Chief Letteney, if you can give me a wave. Hi there.
Hello. Hi.
Okay. Chief Catrina Thompson is Chief of Police in Winston-Salem. Of course, we all know that's the Triad area. She serves as board member on numerous boards, including United Way and the Senior Services Foundation. She's been recognized as one of the 50th most influential African Americans in the Piedmont Triad area. Chief Thompson, if you could give me a wave. Hi. And finally, Chief Jennings is Chief of Police in Charlotte, which is, we all know, the largest city in the state. He was recently appointed as chief. Congratulations to you. And he's also the immediate past president of the North Carolina Police Executives Association. Hi there.
How's everybody? Thanks for having me.
So welcome, everyone. I want to jump right in. Let's get started. The order that I introduced you all in, if you don't mind, if we could, that's the order I'd like for us to answer the questions. Is everyone okay with that?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. So we all know it's been about 2.5 months since George Floyd's death. How do you all manage to lead through the negative perception and sometimes fear in the community? We're going to start with you, Chief Harris.
When something like this happens, I tell my staff, this is not a time to pull back from the community. It's a time to take a step closer to the community. So those that have a particular connection with somebody like Mr. Floyd, whatever that connection is, it creates fear. So we need to dispel that. So the first thing we do is communicate. I've communicated in a number of ways, through an editorial, through meetings, through individual times that we've talked within the community. I'm getting a little feedback. I don't know if that's my problem or
maybe we can mute.
Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I think everybody else needs to be on mute. I'm hearing the same thing.
I agree. I'll go ahead and mute my mic, and if everyone could just follow suit.
But in communication, I've got a radio show that I do. I've responded to individuals. I've met with different aspects of our community, particularly the minority sections of our community, and we have had deep discussions about how this has affected everybody. So communication, confirmation that what we saw with Mr. Floyd was wrong. We in law enforcement saw the same video everybody else did initially. There's no excuse for that. There's no explanation. It doesn't fit any of our uses of force or our principles. So confirming with our community that this is not something we endorse. We would not endorse in our departments. And then last, showing our commitment. And our commitment is something we can't do that when something like this happens. It's something we should have been building all along. So to continue that effort in meeting the community needs and showing our commitment within the community.
Thank you. Chief Letteney. We can't hear you. You got to unmute that mic for us.
You are right. Sorry about that. Thank you. I said Chief Harris has set a good foundation answering this question, and I think that's the key to being able to work with our community from here. We are fortunate to have built a strong foundation in all aspects of our community, with outreach, with listening sessions, with forums, with providing services on an ongoing basis for years. So we've built those relationships, which are so important now because we have the structure in place where people are in many cases comfortable in asking those questions and having these hard conversations and talking with us, and letting us know what their concerns are, but then listening and understanding that the video that shocked their conscience shocked our conscience too. And even more so because we know what those officers should have done. We know what the expectation is as police leaders of our officers in a similar circumstance. And watching that video in 8 minutes and 47 seconds that went by was as difficult for law enforcement as it was for citizens and our greater community. So we've had some really good, robust conversations about that. We also don't want to be painted with a broad brush. We understand the concerns, we understand the issues, but we also don't want people to read national news or see what's going on in any other community anywhere else and assume it's the same in the community in which they live. So having the opportunity to have more outreach, to have more communication, for law enforcement to listen and engage and let people know what the truth is about their agency, the good and the bad and the ugly, because none of us are perfect. We're human too. And where we have an opportunity to now be more reflective in light of the recent past, in light of what happened to Mr. Floyd, in light of the law enforcement response around the nation, we can now look at our policies, our procedures, our outreach, our training, our accountability, and maybe reflect differently. And okay, how can we improve? If we have a focus on continuous improvement, as we should, then we will look at this as an opportunity to make sure our agencies are better positioned to ensure this does not happen in our communities and across the state of North Carolina.
Thank you. Chief Thompson.
Much like both Chief Harris and Chief Letteney has already mentioned, number one, we have to acknowledge that what we all saw was wrong. There's nothing else that we can say about it other than it was wrong and it was criminal. And it should never, ever be expected in our profession. But also, as Chief Letteney was mentioning, that it's been important for us in Winston-Salem to have those community relationships long before a George Floyd ever occurred. So community policing, to me, has been the key for us throughout this whole ordeal. While we were seeing rioting all over us, Winston-Salem did not have that. And I have to tell you that we were extremely proud of that. We do believe that community-oriented policing had a lot to do with it, but we also believe that it is our community, our members of our community who were determined that their voices were going to be heard. They were going to march. They were going to protest. And they were going to send the emails and let us know that they are not happy, but they were not going to destroy the communities that they live in and that services them as well. And so I think being open to having those conversations, as my previous colleagues have mentioned, to have the forums, to be open to, and also agreeing to disagree, right? We got to always understand that we're not going to always agree, and that's okay too. I think that's what makes us a healthy community, a healthy society, because everybody looks at things through different lenses, and it's our own history and maturation that kind of set the tone for how we're living our lives. And it's those experiences that kind of shape us and our opinions about law enforcement and the law enforcement profession and expectations as a whole.
And Chief Jennings?
Yes, can you hear me? Oh, so I think the good thing about going last is brevity, because I can just say whatever they said. So, but I will be brief in the fact that I feel like the foundations that we're talking about and the relationships that you build prior to an incident is ever so important in what we do every day. And I do caution, however, that that foundation can crumble off of one incident and can easily go away. And I just look back in Charlotte in 2016 when we had the riots, and we were just prior to that receiving awards from different entities and out of Washington for our work that we've done in the communities. And we thought we had that strong foundation. So what I want to make sure is that not only you build that foundation and maintain it with relationships, but also community collaboration and not outside of community policing and community engagement. The collaboration piece is important to me in that we want to make sure that the citizens have a say in how we police them, and they have a say in what their police department looks like. And when they do that, we feel that that's going to be ownership, and that we become part of the community that we serve as well, because we spend a lot of time in the neighborhoods and in the communities, and we want to be a part of that. And the way to do that is to continuously work with the citizens and hear what they want as well.
And given that some community members have fear, have you all publicly denounced this kind of behavior? And, I guess, what does that conversation look like? What has it looked
like? For me, Akilah, it was the communication aspect of it. From the beginning, I got phone calls, I received emails, and I responded to every one of those. And I talked to the people, either through the phone calls or through the emails, about our department and why we are different and how we are open to any kind of input we can get from the community on being better. I mentioned before that I do a radio show once every 2 weeks. I was on that radio show talking about this. I was invited to attend some of the marches, and every time I got an invitation, I attended. And what we marched for was things that we could all agree on, and that was peace, justice for Mr. Floyd, and well-being in our community. So it was easy for our small, tight-knit town to rise above some of the concerns that we've seen nationally.
Chief Letteney.
So there are many ways to get a message out. And the questions we were getting were, how is the Apex Police Department different from what I see happening in other parts of the nation? And that's a valid question. So I welcome those questions, so I can answer that with the facts of how we recruit, how we select, how we train, how we hold accountable, how we develop leadership, and all of those things that we do internal to the organization to make sure we are providing a professional service to all in our community that respects their rights and dignity across the board. So early on, I put out a statement on our website about the incident and how terrible it was, and that's still on our website today. I received, as I'm sure my colleagues did as well, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails, phone calls, social media messages, and so on. And I've answered, to the best of my knowledge, every one of them, because people are asking very good questions. And when they have a concern and they have a question about something as simple as what's your policy on use of force? How do you compare to the campaign zero research? 8 can't wait. What have you done to change your policy and look internally? How do you train? How do you say all those things? We have an answer that hopefully will make them comfortable in reaching out to the police department, knowing that we collaborate with our community, we listen to our community, we are part of public safety, but not the sole provider of it, because the public needs to come together. And when we work together, when we develop those positive relationships, we have a great quality of life. And we want to enhance that. And actually, that is very much part of our mission statement.
Chief Thompson.
So one of the ways that we did it here in Winston was myself and our sheriff for our county, Sheriff Bobby Kimbrough. We immediately came out and did a press conference denouncing the actions that were being taken or had been taken against Mr. Floyd. And you know, I think it's important that we say not just Mr. Floyd, even though that his death tended to be the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. But we know that there's been others prior to and even since his death. But in doing that and laying out the just utter, I guess, acknowledgement that what we saw was wrong, that it was not the expectation of law enforcement and should not be. We also did a video and reached out to our fellow law enforcement executives across the state to ask them to be a part of that video. And basically, you know, we said who we are and said what we saw, and that we felt the same thing everybody else was feeling when they saw that video, and that we denounced the actions. And we used those exact words. We denounced the actions taken by that officer or those officers against George Floyd. So I think starting out the gate, if you would, after that happened, we did that. And as again, the other chiefs have mentioned, we have participated in the protests because, you know, I think it's interesting that people realize that we're in the law enforcement profession. We don't have a hard time acknowledging, at least not those that I've interacted with, acknowledging wrongdoing when done by law enforcement officers. Because I think it's important that people understand those of us who are in this profession for the right reasons have dedicated our lives and have sworn that we will sacrifice our own lives to save others. And that's real for us. And so to us, there's nothing worse than a bad officer, because they go against everything that we swore to uphold. And so it's not a challenge at all for us to acknowledge and to say that it's wrong. It's disappointing to find ourselves in that situation, but it's not hard at all to acknowledge when that time comes. And so again, being a part of those conversations, I think it's also important, though, that we take this opportunity to make sure that our community know that as law enforcement officers, we wear bulletproof vests attached to our chest every day and carry a sidearm. That's leaving our homes, going to work every day. So that in and of itself says that these are tools of our trade, which means that at some point in our career, we hope we don't, but we acknowledge the fact that we may need those tools. And I think that's the expectation. When you see an officer, if you see an officer that's not wearing a badge, that's not wearing a service weapon, there's a question as to whether or not that person is really a police officer. So those are tools of the trade. And so what that says is we might have to use those things. We hope that all the training that we've gone through, up to and including our ability to communicate with people, will prevent us from being in that situation. But if we do, there are guidelines, there are laws that we must follow as we're entering into a deadly force situation. I think it's important to know that a lot of law enforcement is not pretty, but just because it's ugly doesn't mean it's wrong. And so while we've got to acknowledge the wrong when we see it's wrong, we've got to also acknowledge that there's some parts of what we do that's not pretty, but it's not wrong. What we saw happen to George Floyd was ugly and it was wrong.
And Chief Jennings?
Yeah, I have to say, I was very intentional from the start denouncing the murder of George Floyd, and the way you have to do that is, whether it's social media, having those difficult conversations, whether it's on a panel or Zoom conferences, anything like that. And I marched. I was out there with them, and some officers feel that we shouldn't be out there, and I think that what I was trying to make sure that that not just within CMPD, but to represent the fact that we do stand against that. We stand against social injustice. We stand against police brutality. But at the same time, they have to. People on the outside need to know that we don't accept that, and we try to make sure that we hold ourselves accountable in that aspect. I think Chief Thompson's idea of getting out into having a press conference to denounce that is brilliant, and things like that. Any way you can reach the public and say that we stand against that as well, because I think the perception of a lot of people in the community felt as if, if we stand on the sidelines and don't say anything, that we're okay with it, or we're trying to figure out a way to justify what happened. And my comments all the time have been, I've spoken with police chiefs and police executives across the country, and I have yet to find one that tries to excuse what the officer did to Mr. Floyd. So often you get these incidents, and there's usually more to the story, or things that you don't know that maybe it can be justified. But in this situation, I couldn't think of a single thing that you could have told me that would have justified that. It made my stomach sick to sit and watch it, and it shocked the conscience. And I think that's what it did for the public, and that's why we saw the outrage that we saw. But at this point, it's important to let the public know we hear you, and to do those things that you realize in your department. How can you make your department better? And that's my message. We're going to continue to improve, and we're going to do that by listening to the people.
So, Chiefs, we talk about, denouncing this kind of behavior. Knowing that, should there be a more, I want to say, uniform approach to the use of force between all law enforcement agencies?
Use of force is one of those key high intensity. It's one of those issues that law enforcement it's central to what we do, and because of that, we pay a lot of attention to use of force. In the 40 years that I've been in law enforcement, it's changed quite a bit. But is there kind of a uniform approach? The courts have narrowed a lot of it down, so the courts narrow us to a certain point. That we have training in the state for every officer to go through, and we always address use of force yearly. Each agency talks about best practices. We share policies. Our policies are rarely proprietary. Most of our agencies throughout the state, if I call and say, can you send me your best practice policy, I get it. And so we have that chance to do that. There's also joint lobbying efforts between the sheriff's departments across the state and the police association. So we see a lot of the same material. Chief Letteney mentioned the 8 Can't Wait. When that came out, when that initiative came out, I looked at our policy and looked at our practice and our training, and we were doing all 8 of those. I shored up some of those in our policy to make them a little bit better. But I would venture a guess, if we pulled a our policies across the state, we would find some policies that are fairly uniform already. But in law enforcement, what we do is we take those things that are highly litigious, highly concerning in our public, and we talk about those all the time. We do training. We make sure we're on the cutting edge. North Carolina particularly.
Chief Letteney.
We have to understand that law enforcement and carrying out our mission is very dynamic. We cannot regulate or legislate everything a police officer does and make it a robotic act. We are dealing with people in the midst of their life experience, in the midst of chaos, in the midst of high emotions, and in the midst of all kinds of different things that are going on and a lot of dynamics that the officer may or may not know about. So the officer is generally reacting to what the other person is doing. Use of force generally is a reaction to force being applied or resistance to from somebody else or trying to escape or so on. And to be overly restrictive of that limits an officer's ability to keep him or herself and the general public safe. And we want these encounters to be safe for everyone. The suspect, the officer, the community, everyone involved. That's the ultimate goal. The courts have ruled very clearly over many, many, many years, up to and including the United States Supreme Court, about what an officer can or can't do. And they have made it clear that the test to look at whether a use of force in a particular case was appropriate was not in the light of day on Monday morning. It was, what did the officer know at the time this was applied, and what would a reasonable officer have done under the same circumstances? And so the Supreme Court has looked at the fact that it is a dynamic situation. And when we look at something through litigation months or years later, it may be clear that an officer should have done something different. However, at the time, what was reasonable? And so that's the first test. And the second is, was it necessary? Were there other methods that a reasonable officer could have used where a certain level of force was not absolutely necessary? So to that end, and while there are very different opinions on all of that across the country, there are different state laws, there are different agency policies. The expectation of a particular area or region or state or community is not always going to be the same. So there will be some nuances from one department to the next. However, there is a national consensus use of force policy. This was put out in 2017. The International Association of Chiefs of Police was one of the lead organizations on that policy. And there were many others. I think there were 11 total law enforcement professional associations and organizations that came together for the first time ever and collaborated to come up with this national consensus use of force policy. So this was 2017. This was done methodically with very good minds, very good research, and very well-respected police leaders across the nation that came up with this. And that has since been reissued. And to, again, understand that we need to always look back and see, in light of recent experiences, what could we do different? What could we do better? How can we continually improve? The organizations did that, and they reissued that national consensus use of force policy in July. And there weren't a lot of changes, but there were a couple of tweaks to make it even better. So while we don't support one national law that restricts law enforcement too severely, I mean, there has to be some standards, some protocols, and we support that. But the dynamics of these interactions have to lead to some ability of a police officer to do what is necessary under some basic parameters and guidelines to keep everyone in that situation safe. And if that is done with broad legislation, with the Supreme Court decisions we already have and have had for years, and then something like a national consensus use of force policy, we are getting more agencies on the same page, thinking the same way, and getting a policy in place that will help guide their staff.
Thank you. Chief Thompson.
Wow, I don't know if there's much more left for me to say. I think between Chief Harris and Chief Letteney, the boxes have pretty much been checked on it. I think at the end of the day, I mean, and I'm honest in that I think he really has covered it really well. You know, we can set some national standards, but we have to understand that climate and environment, and then some other laws in different states can affect those things as well. I think the biggest thing is to know and understand it doesn't take much at all for people to know what's right. And that's in some sense there's a bit of common sense that go along with it. But I think what's really important is that community understands, and I think in our law enforcement profession, we should, during non-enforcement, non-contentious times, try to do a better job of explaining to citizens, to our communities, what they're actually seeing, especially in the days in the world of social media, which I'm not a part of at all. So it's kind of outside of my my wheelhouse. But knowing that this is the world that we're living in and everybody is drawn to social media, I think as a law enforcement profession, when tensions are not high and emotions aren't extremely strong or as strong as they are now, we need to take the time to show examples of interactions that we have. And not just our individual agencies, but interactions that are going on in law enforcement across the country. And then explain, going back to what I said about certain parts of law enforcement is just not pretty, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong. And being able to, again, when emotions aren't as high, being able to show examples and then explain based on how we've been trained why this may look bad, but is not wrong and is perfectly within the law. It's never going to look good when law enforcement has to put their hands on someone. It's never going to look good when law enforcement has to take the life of someone. But we also know that there are times, many times, when that happens, and it falls within every law and every policy that any reasonable agency would have. Again, it's not a good situation, but also I think it's important that we understand and make sure our community understand what they're actually looking at, and that's a challenge.
Thank you. Chief Jennings.
Yeah, you know, I certainly think you can have guidelines with use of force nationwide. I don't think you can create policy from a national level and put it on, but the guidelines are good. You know, we have some of that. It's called the Constitution. We took an oath to uphold that, and we also took an oath to uphold the laws of our states as well. So, so what we did, and we recently, over the last couple of years, we revamped totally our use of force policy. And you heard Chief Letteney talk about it's a reaction and response to the actions of another individual, and we react that way. So when we met with our community leaders and some of our organizational leaders across, we changed the name, not only changed some of the content of our use of force policy, but it's response to resistance policy now. So we have done some work in that area. I know we're a learning agency, and we will admit that and say that. So we're always looking at ways to change it, and we have been. So you heard earlier, use of force is not pretty. It's never going to be pretty. It's when we have to resort to using force on an individual, it looks poorly and reflects poorly, but it's absolutely necessary at some points, because what I try to reiterate is we have to get to where we're not having the suspects become the victims at this point, and I think we're seeing a lot of that. And people need to understand that we deal with bad people out there. And we're gonna, as long as we are human beings doing this job, we're going to make mistakes. So what the community has to be able to look at us in a sense that we're going to hold ourselves accountable when we make those mistakes. Not only are we going to get better, but that we're going to hold our own accountable in that sense. So We still have a lot of work to do, but I think a lot of agencies have their eyes open now, and they're willing and open to continue to improve.
Okay, this question is going to be for Chief Harris and Chief Jennings. I want to know, does racial bias exist in policing? And if so, how do you go about minimizing that?
Is that me first or? Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, so sure it does. I think racial bias exists throughout our nation in every single profession, every single job. I mean, what we have to do is have people identify what those biases are that they might feel, and they cannot reflect on what they do and how they treat people and when they come in contact with our citizens. Because to sit and think that there are no biases. We all have our own implicit biases but you'd be naive to think that does not exist. What it cannot do is spill over into what you do as your job. We have to be professional. There has to be accountability for how we treat people, and that we need to be equitable across the board. So to answer that question as shortly as I can is yes, but it can't reflect on what we do as a profession.
And how do you minimize that though within your department?
So within the department, we've done a lot as far as training is concerned to be able to bring those out and to let people know that, hey, you have biases. We all have implicit biases. And so you train your officers to make sure that is not playing a role in how you treat your public and your citizens that we're out here to serve. And one is to be able to recognize it themselves. And that's the first step. So when you can bring that out and say and recognize it, then that's when you can start to control it.
Chief Harris.
Our state Department of Justice does quite a bit of training for all officers. That not only do they run the basic law enforcement academy, but they also do ongoing in-service training. Every year, a part of that training is geared to being able to learn more about minorities, youth, and those that are different than us, and apply that to our jobs. So that's one way, is through training. Another way, I've already mentioned it, it's us embracing all aspects of our community, all factions of our community, and make sure nobody gets left out. One of the basic principles of community policing is that we particularly serve those that are more vulnerable than the average citizen. That can be the elderly, youth, minority, poor, the homeless person. It is the single parents that are struggling to make ends meet. Those people need extra attention from us. And those are the people that we should be spending time with, not just answering the calls, but talking to them and finding out how we can help with other needs that they might have. It might not even be a police need, but we can do that. And when I reflect back in time on my career, I realized that I could have done a better job of that on a daily basis. So I'm really trying to teach my officers to do that. When we talk about diversity, we can't talk diversity. We need to hire diversity. We need to challenge ourselves to grow by being around people that aren't necessarily, in our own perception, just like us. It could be a different religion, a different age. I grew up in North Carolina. When I meet somebody that's from outside of this state, I can talk to them about what knowledge they're bringing from their community. Brevard College just started introducing their freshmen. I'm in between two presentations to two sets of 150 students, new students. I asked one of the classes, where are you from? They're from all over, Connecticut, Florida, all over the eastern seaboard. There are students that have ties to the West Coast. So find that diversity in all aspects and teach my staff, not just to get trained on it, but to immerse themselves in our community, because there's so much richness in diversity.
This next question is going to be for Chief Letteney and Chief Thompson. Chief Thompson, we would like to start with you. You know, we hear calls for defunding the police. What kind of impact could this have on your department?
Well, defunding to the police, and I think it means different things depending on in different areas. You know, if you look at what's going on in Seattle and Minneapolis right now, defunding is greatly impacting financially the budgets of the law enforcement and their abilities to actually do the job. For our community, you know, and I'll just say, just yesterday in Winston-Salem, we had a 15-year-old to get shot and killed right here in our city. Last week, we had two 14-year-olds to get killed. And so you're talking about defunding police. You're talking about abolishing police. Who's going to bring justice to those responsible for killing our future? Who's going to investigate the child abuse cases that we're seeing happening all the time, not just in our communities, but across the country? Who's going to investigate the elder abuse that's going on, again, on a daily basis? I think we need to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And when you're talking about defunding police to its core, if you're talking about reallocating funds from a police budget to go towards, and this is what I keep hearing, to go towards some social programs, two things come to mind. Number one, if you're talking about doing that, I'm okay with that. If that means that no longer are you going to expect law enforcement to respond to involuntary commitments or some of these other non-criminal calls that everyone calls the police for, because all those things, every time an officer responds, it's costing something. Even if that means it costs a call that is a criminal call to be put on hold until there's a law enforcement officer that's free to handle it. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, again, I guess the idea behind what is the main goal? Are you saying that in your community you don't need police? Because I could assure you here in Winston-Salem, that's not the case. And while you may hear some people here say, yes, that's exactly what I mean, we saw what happened in the autonomous zone. I think that was allocated up in I believe it was Seattle. They thought that was okay for a while until shooting and all types of violence start to happen. And then what happened? Once you start removing police from a society like the one that we live in, you see chaos and catastrophe that none of us have ever seen or could even imagine. So, you know, if you want to talk about having more conversations with police, if you want to talk about, again, not having police involved in certain activities that we've traditionally been involved in, or responding to certain calls for services that we've traditionally been involved in, and quite frankly, probably really shouldn't, but everybody calls the police when there's no one else to call, then I'm good with that. The issue that I have with the whole idea of taking part of the police budget and putting it into social programs, while I believe that there is definitely a need for strength, financial strength in our social programs, these issues did not just happen since George Floyd. You know, I have people living and growing up, our kids, in the 27101 zip code, who have, if you look at the Robert Wood Johnson's life expectancy website, that research shows that our children living and growing up in that zip code have a 14-year lower life expectancy than our children living and growing up in our 27104 zip code. And in some places, there's only 1.5 miles that separate those two zip codes, yet they're worlds apart. That didn't just happen since May 25th. These are things that's been occurring over decades. So to put it all on law enforcement, to me, is disingenuous. And personally, while I do agree that there is some work and there is some additional funding that is much needed in social programming in communities, I think it's totally unfair that you say all of that funding should come from the law enforcement budget, because the law enforcement profession is not doing their jobs.
We are running out of time just a bit. I'm going to ask you a different question, Chief Letteney, if you don't mind. So we know that building trust is essential to community policing. How do you maintain the trust that you've developed in your community?
Well, I think our trust has taken a hit, and understandably so. So to develop trust, you have to have that foundation I talked about before. You have to invest in positive relationships. You have to invest in your community, in all aspects of your community, and show that you are willing to listen, that you are transparent, that you do want to have community partnerships, as Chief Jennings said, to help people understand what we do, and then let them have a say in how their law enforcement agency is structured and what services they provide. Because we do a lot of things that we shouldn't have to do in law enforcement, as Chief Thompson said. So to build that trust, we have to recognize that generally what law enforcement does when we're called to a scene is negative. We interact with people in the midst of their life experience, as I said, and it's not always positive. They were a victim of a crime. They're being arrested. They were stopped for a traffic violation. That's a negative interaction. So those things are going to happen, but we need to be very deliberate about creating positive relationships, positive interactions, so our community knows us as people first, not just police officers. And when they know us as people and understand we make mistakes and understand the heart behind the badge, that we are truly committed to a better quality of life, to keeping people safe, and we want to collaborate with our citizens in all aspects of our community, then together we will build trust, we will build legitimacy, and where we have situations that create concern or issues that erode that trust, we can come back to the table, sit down and talk about it, figure out why, and figure out what we need to do to move forward.
You know, that leads me to my next question, and this question is for you, Chief Harris. I'm wondering, how do you all manage to recruit officers that look like the community they serve? And are there any challenges, recruitment challenges?
There are recruitment challenges, but the first thing I do is I go where diversity lives. I go to the schools. We've got several colleges in our town. I spend quite a bit of time there. As I mentioned before, I actually teach at our 4-year university. So go where diversity is. Be open as a department. We do tours. We invite people to come to our community, to our department, and see what we do through ride-alongs, through tours, through interaction with us. I've had people come and interview me in the past, students. It's a great opportunity for recruitment. The smaller counties have an opportunity through the state, through something they call the Criminal Justice Fellows Scholarship Program, where somebody getting out of high school can go to 2 years of community college and have that paid for by the state of North Carolina if they commit to law enforcement once they get their degree, their associate's degree. I have incentives within my department for people that actually recruit and bring good recruits to me. I've talked extensively with our minority community saying, please bring me qualified recruits. We will give them the best opportunity to get hired. And all of those things have helped us get added diversity into our department.
Thank you. And, you know, Chief Jennings, this last question is for you. Given the current climate, I want to ask, what techniques and strategies have you implemented to address mental health within your department?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. And with ours, you know, people talk about do the police really need to be responding and now I don't know if you're looking at it internally with our employees' mental health or externally with mental health calls for services.
Yes.
I can answer it quick internally. Oh, okay, great. So that'll help me answer that one then. So we hired a psychologist to be full time within our department. We've also been pretty intentional about releasing the stigma that we often need help on the mental health side to make sure that we're doing our job. You know, employee wellness is one of my core four under my administration as well. So that goes well beyond just making sure they have equipment and facilities and all of that. Employee wellness goes into their mental well-being and mental health, and to bring that out and say that it's okay, and to say that we all are going to experience times where we need to get some help on the mental health end, and things that we're doing is outside of your basic EAP programs or other benefits that your city or your agency might hold. And we're also looking at other things, just to keep it short, but we're looking at other things that we can do where we can have group sessions that officers can attend, and to speak their feelings and to kind of have that out and release some of the anxiety when it comes to talking about what you're feeling and things that you're going through. So
We are wrapping things up in just a bit, and I want to hear from all of you with this last question really quickly. So in closing, all of you are leaders in the cities that you represent and across the state. What would you like to see change? We'll start with you, Chief Harris.
Are we talking law enforcement in general?
Yes.
Or are we talking about specific agencies? I feel very blessed to be in law enforcement in North Carolina. We have really amazing associations. When we have chiefs associations in other locations, they seem to segment themselves into the smaller agencies, the medium-sized, and the larger. Right in this event, you're talking to two of our larger city chiefs. They show every bit of respect to even the smaller agency chiefs like me. And when I ask for help, they are there. So the unit, the effort we have in North Carolina to make law enforcement better is remarkable. What do I need as a smaller agency? I think I need understanding from the community, patience with the community, input from the community. I need people to tell me what their expectations are. And then once we know what we want out of law enforcement, the realization that this is a shared responsibility. When we first created law enforcement in England in the early 1800s, the intention was for police to be the professionals that did what everybody in the community did. Over time, we've lost that connection. When somebody calls and says, hey, there's something going on in my neighborhood, what I want to know is what they can do to help resolve that problem. So community support, I think, is extremely important.
Thank you. Chief Letteney?
I would simply say relationship. And we can't make a relationship on our own. It's a two-way street. We need our community to engage with us as we engage with them and have one collaborative approach. I would ask people to ask their questions, to be involved, and to be open-minded. Don't believe a false narrative just because it sounds good. Don't believe the first thing you see on social media, and then everything else you hear is discounted. Listen to what we have to say. Ask questions, challenge if it's appropriate, but be open-minded to the fact that there may be a different narrative or a different perspective than what you heard from someone else or you saw on social media or so on, and engage in that ongoing positive relationship.
Chief Thompson?
I would like to see the violence end, particularly the gun violence. We are losing generations of people every day. I'd like to see our community get more engaged, be angered more on a regular basis, not just when law enforcement is involved. in misconduct, but to be outraged about every life that's lost in our community. I'd like to see us be able to work together. We're all people and we all want the same thing. And that's to be able to live in a healthy and safe community, one where our children can thrive and grow, and our community, and by default, our nation can become better as a result of it.
And finally, Chief Jennings.
Well said. Well said. All of you, well said. I just think all I can do is add to what's already been said, and that's collaboration. I want to see, I think as an agency, or my advice to any agency at this point is, if you're not willing and open to change, if you're not willing and open to hearing the voices of your communities, then you're setting yourself up for failure. And what you need to make sure that that you're accomplishing is that you're policing, that your citizens are having a say in how you police them. And I think that's where we're going to be able to succeed. And I look forward to seeing what the future holds for law enforcement.
Well, I thank you all for joining this virtual town hall. Of course, we look forward to seeing more of the great work from the North Carolina Police Executives Association. And thanks again. You all take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.